The more we learn about the details leading up to the killing of 26 people and wounding of 20 more at a Texas church yesterday, the more troubling it gets. Investigators say 26-year-old Devin Kelley had sent threatening messages to his mother-in-law before the attack. That mother-in-law has attended services at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, but was not there yesterday when Kelley went in with a tactical vest, a skull mask, and an assault-style rifle, hitting nearly every person inside, killing 26, including 14 kids, a pregnant woman, and his wife's grandmother. Kelley served in the Air Force and in 2012 was court-martialed for assaulting his first wife and reportedly fracturing his infant stepson's skull. He was sentenced to a year in military prison before being released with a bad conduct discharge. The question many are asking now is, how did a guy with this kind of history possibly get a gun? It's a question we'll get into in a few minutes, but first, to a man who's covered far too many tragedies like these and the political fallout after. Once a presidential speechwriter and top aide to one of the most influential House speakers in history, Chris Matthews then made the jump to journalism. The host of MSNBC's Hardball has written a slew of books with tales ranging from the Kennedy-Nixon rivalry to an unlikely duo that got a lot of things done, his former boss Tip O'Neill and President Ronald Reagan. Now he's out with his 8th book. It's called Bobby Kennedy, A Raging Spirit. Chris joined me earlier today to talk about it. Chris, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm a teenager growing up in Philly. I go to 15th and Chestnut Street.
Yeah.
And I see Bobby Kennedy talk about our responsibility to our fellow human beings, and I was hooked for life. What's the allure, the Bobby Kennedy allure for you?
He sort of like exposed himself more than any politician I've ever seen. He would go into a meeting in Manhattan with James Baldwin and all these tough, militant African-American guys, intellectuals, and he'd let them rip him apart. And then he'd go afterwards, and he got so mad, he'd say, enough. This is as much as I can take. And then he's mad at them, and then he walks out of the room, and he starts thinking, he said, you know what, I'd be with them if I was one of them. But
he wasn't always the civil rights icon
that's what I meant.
That we see him to be, right? I mean, he wasn't crazy about the freedom riders.
He said, I didn't stay awake at night worrying about civil rights. In fact, he didn't like civil disobedience. He never did. He thought law and justice worked together. So he disagreed with Dr. King about that.
So what was the tipping point? What moved him?
I think it was John Siegenthaler getting his head bashed in with a lead pipe down in Alabama when he was down there looking over the freedom riders, looking out for them. And some southern right-wing guy, not right-wing, he didn't even say right-wing in those days, just some guy didn't like what they were doing, hit him over the head with a lead pipe. And that's when John Lewis, who's still around today, said that's what moved him. And Harry Belafonte said that's when Bobby's heart moved, because a friend of his, his top aide, just got a head bashed in.
You know, the speech, I watched it this morning for maybe the 100th time, the Indianapolis speech after Martin Luther King. And was it Mayor Lugar didn't want him to give this? A lot of people didn't want him to give this speech.
The police wouldn't come in with him. It was that scary.
And why did he decide to do it?
I think he believed once he had committed to that event, it was an African-American neighborhood, a tough, hood, and he went in there with the police not coming with him. What I was able to find out for the book was when he went in there, he's standing on the flatbed truck, he's ready to talk, and he asked the guy next to him, because it's on the tape, do they know? So he didn't know that the people didn't know about Dr. King being killed until the moment he started to talk. So we
can hear it in the crowd.
Well, the crowd were cheering him, thinking this is a good time speech with one of their heroes, and it turns out he's got to deliver the worst news in history to the people in front of him. And I think that empathy, it seemed a little at the time to me like a little hokey in the sense of saying my brother was killed by a white guy, because he wasn't killed for race reasons. He was killed for ideological reasons. The guy was a communist. But it was his way of awkwardly saying, I know something about suffering, and we can't blame everybody on racial matters. We can't blame everything on race.
You in your intro, I don't know what it's called, the foreword, the intro, whatever it is, the third or fourth line, this book is about the Bobby Kennedy we'd want to have today, the kind of leader we'd lack today. I mean, it's hard for anybody to argue with the second half of that. Could Bobby Kennedy be Bobby Kennedy in this dysfunctional mess we find ourselves in?
Look, we all know the racial divide in this country goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. 250 years of slavery, we're not going to forget about it. 100 years of Jim Crow, we're not going to forget about it. And the 50 years we've had isn't so great. But he had a great line. He said, we have to make an effort. It's as simple as that. Are you going to try to avoid racial division, or are you going to exploit it? And we have a president today, and we all know who exploits it all the time with the statues, whatever comes up, to take a knee, any chance to divide. Whereas Bobby kept trying. He said, make an effort. He wasn't some pluperfect liberal that said we can fix it overnight.
Speaking of not a pluperfect liberal, every time someone who admires Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, reads about him being enamored of Joe McCarthy, people sit back. It was the anti-communist thread. He was a fervent anti-communist, right?
Well, everybody... McCarthy rode very high from 1950 to 1954. Bobby never lost affection for the guy. And I think especially when he became a drunk trying to kill himself with booze, which he did. And even when he wrote the letter, or the resolution condemning him for the Democratic side, which led to his censure, he never lost an emotional connection to the guy. Maybe I think it's the Irish thing, too. But when he went to the gravesite, he basically snuck there to the funeral.
In Wisconsin, yeah.
And he goes out there, he stays in the car. A reporter let him sit in his car, never ratted on him. He just wanted to be there to show his personal respect. Jack and Teddy both said that's what they most respected about their brother, his loyalty, even though he knew McCarthy was wrong. And that's something about growing up and learning we were talking about a minute ago. He knew that the guy he loved, had tremendous affection for it, was wrong. And that takes growing up.
Let's talk about a guy he didn't love, who the current president learned at the knee of, Roy Cohn. Obviously, there's a great line in your book. One of his sisters, Bobby Kennedy's sisters, says he had a gift for estrangement. That's one of my favorite lines in the whole book.
Maybe he did, but it was easy to dislike Roy.
But he didn't like him right away, right?
Well, it may have been because Roy was gay.
And you really think that's what it may have been?
I said it may have been. I think that was part of it. I think everybody thinks so. Bobby was a real straight arrow in many ways, and I think he thought... He didn't like the guy. Let's just put it this way. He thought he was destroying McCarthy. McCarthy loved Roy Cohn as an operative. He was making him famous. There's a great line in it where Bobby says he took him up on a mountain and showed him all the beautiful things. And I talked about this with Ethel Ken. I said, that's right out of the New Testament. That's St. Matthew's Gospel, where the devil takes Jesus up onto the mountain and offers him everything if he would bow down and worship him. He was basically saying Roy Cohn is the devil because Roy gave him what he wanted, publicity.
And Roy Cohn, for those who don't know, taught Donald Trump how to say a loss is a win, and obviously he defended the family in those housing discrimination cases.
He's not a good guy.
You know what I learned?
He's not a good guy.
You know what I learned from both your book and a piece I think you wrote in the New York Times, or the Washington Post, or something. I wasn't aware of the fact that Bobby Kennedy, shortly before he was killed, gave a speech in Roseburg, Oregon, which is currently most infamous because of obviously the murders at Umpqua Community College. How much did he get? What was the audience like, and how much did he really care about this?
He was told going in there, the sheriff told him going in there, don't talk about guns because it's a gun town. They're all lumberjacks, you know. And these guys, they show up with all their placards that save the Second Amendment. You know, the bad guys will get them anyway, and they're screaming all that stuff at him. Of course, he talks about gun control, and he talks about why would you want to have mail order rifles? What would be the thing? Today we take that for granted. Of course, everything's mail order. But he said, you know, my brother was killed by a mail order rifle. And in fact, he gave this, I think, apocryphal case, but he said at the time it had happened, that somebody on death row had ordered a rifle by mail, and it had come. I don't know what guy in the post office said. They said to send it over to this guy, and he said, I don't know what I'm doing here. They paid for it. And he was basically saying, let's be reasonable. Crazy people shouldn't get guns, and kids shouldn't get guns. And that seemed like a reasonable thing. But it didn't work.
Can we return to current events for a minute? I know you're not, you have no great love for the President of the United States, nor does the
Well, it's not personal, by the way. Every time I've bumped into him, we always get along, but, you know, it's just not been great.
Do the Democrats know how to be the opposition party 12 months in?
They suffer from the idiotic belief that politics is a seesaw.
What do you mean by that?
If he goes down, they go up.
Meaning that they have made their own case. Is that your point?
All they have to do is sit on the sideline. Said Nancy and Chuck, they just sit there and wait for Trump to make a fool of himself, and they're going to do well in the next election. And you know what? It may work. But that's not leadership. They ought to be offering a program to get the economy better off for working people, more jobs for real jobs with real money, instead of just whimpering about the tax cut. Instead of just being against the tax cut, I think they ought to offer a jobs bill and really build this country up again. And they don't want to do it.
Getting back to, is guns the wrong issue for them to cross that identity divide? We had your colleague Chuck Todd on the radio with us a couple of weeks ago, right after Las Vegas, and Chuck and Marjorie Egan and I were exultant, saying, my God, this senator is for banning bump stocks. This senator, of course, we'd never heard of bump stocks before.
Yeah, I know.
And Chuck Todd said to us on the air, he says, until the NRA gives its permission, nothing's going to happen. Las Vegas and bump stocks, nothing has happened.
Nothing.
Obviously, yesterday in Texas, we had a guy who assaulted his wife and kid.
AR-15.
Is anything going to happen there?
No.
Is that an issue for Democrats, or should they stay away from it?
Well, it's a blue state issue. And unfortunately, where I grew up, Pennsylvania, it's not a good issue. It cost Joe Clark, one of the great liberal senators, his entire career. I don't think, I do think it's interesting that when that happened in Las Vegas, that every bump stock in the country was sold.
Who's the closest to Bobby Kennedy today in 2017?
Oh, my God. Who's the closest? I don't know.
Anybody have any pieces of him?
I look at someone like Sherrod Brown in Ohio, a guy who went to Yale but doesn't let it show. Has a gravelly voice, labor guy, a liberal, I guess you'd say. And I think there's a bit of that around. It's tough to find. Maybe the mayor here, a little bit
Marty
of that.
Walsh.
I really think you have to be for law and order and justice together. I don't think you can take the one side, Black Lives side, and just say cops are bad. I think Bobby, one of the first things I knew about Bobby when I was a Capitol policeman was I used to hang around with the Capitol. You're laughing, but
no, I know. I knew this. I had forgotten you were.
Harry Reid had the job.
That is true.
The great story was this guy, the building engineer, the super, who would fix everything at night, and he said, I know these guys. And he's always watching them. And he goes, yeah, Jack was the charm, Bobby was the brains. And I wondered about that, but maybe that was, in a way, nuanced of truth to that. And then he goes, you know what? I used to watch all these liberal senators come by here up the escalator. I'd watch all these. He didn't say snooty, but I know what he meant. And he said Ribicoff, Fulbright, very senatorial. He said of all the Democratic senators, the only one that ever made a point to always say hello to the cops was Bobby.
That's huge. And
that told me everything about class and law and order. And I said, he wasn't a snob. And all his staff guys called him Bob, not Bobby. And he actually hung around with his staff guys, whereas Jack really hung out with the aristocrats.
Chris Matthews, love the book. Photographs are surreal,
nice. Thank you. They're real.
It's great to see you.
Thank you.
The book again is Bobby Kennedy, A Raging Spirit.